Hello and welcome. This is my presentation against drunk driving, and my name is Kelly Winston. Alright, so first we're going to talk about the effects of alcohol on the brain. So alcohol affects the brain's pathways of communication by slowing down its neurons, which has a direct effect on mood and actions. So alcohol is a central nervous system depressant that lowers inhibitions by slowing down the brain activity, like I just mentioned, and its use has the potential to create psychological dependence, which is why so many people become alcoholics. So glutamate is the main neurotransmitter that alcohol affects, and this directly affects memory. And alcohol also affects serotonin transmitters, so the brain tries to compensate for these changes, which can lead to alcohol dependence. So now we're going to go over some of the physiological effects of alcohol, and first we're going to go over the acute effects, which are basically the things that affect you right then and there. So some of these effects are alcoholic cardiomyopathy, which means that your heart's muscle is weakened, which means your heartbeat is weaker. And then another thing that can happen are arrhythmias, which is basically just meaning that your heartbeat is weaker. And another thing that can happen is stroke, high blood pressure. But there is one good thing about alcohol use is that if you only drink alcohol every once in a while, which meaning like you only have one drink, it can actually be good for your heart. So now to continue, some more of the acute effects are that alcohol has an adverse effect on your liver and your pancreas. And another one is that there's the possibility of death by asphyxiation, which basically means choking and you can't breathe. And another one is the loss of body heat, because alcohol is a peripheral vasodilator, and this basically just means that your blood vessels that are closest to the skin dilate, and this makes you feel warmer, but in reality your body temperature is actually dropping. And then lastly, there's dehydration. So some more of the acute effects are that drinking alcohol reduces your REM sleep, which is basically your most intense level of sleep. This is when you dream. And this is the most important kind of sleep. And this is interesting because a lot of people think that, drinking alcohol or having a nightcap actually helps you sleep, but in reality, it doesn't. So another thing that alcohol can have is pregnancy issues. And one of these main ones is fetal alcohol syndrome, which is basically just having really adverse effects on your baby. And another thing is that alcohol can interact really badly with other drugs, and it can intensify both of the effects of alcohol and the other drug. And then another obvious one is hangovers. And lastly, alcoholism can heighten your risk for different types of cancer, especially different types of cancer in women specifically. Now we're going to discuss some of the behavioral effects of alcohol use. And the first one is blackouts, which a lot of people talk about. And a blackout actually means that you were still conscious while the event was happening, but that you can't remember it. So another one is that people have academic problems with heavy alcohol use because they just don't really have time for their studies. Another one is the possibility of injury or assault. Also, they are more likely to engage in other types of crime, also engaging in harmful or unwanted sexual activity. And in addition, they're just more likely to make poor choices in general while they're intoxicated. And lastly, driving skills have a direct impairment on alcohol consumption. And this is an interesting statistic that in 2011, alcohol consumption was to blame for 31% of traffic deaths, and that's a huge factor of preventable deaths. So now we're going to discuss how alcohol affects violence, aggression, and most importantly, driving. So Alcohol can cause one to become more violent and aggressive due to the slowing of neurotransmitter communication, and this triggers mood changes and imbalances, which is why people tend to get irritable and just angry when they drink because they can be very emotional, and being emotional causes people to lash out and not make the best decisions. So, this is a very interesting statistic as well, that alcohol consumption occurs previously to 50% of incidents of violence, 40% of incidents of sexual aggression, 70% of incidents of domestic violence, and 60% of incidents of child molestation. So as you can see, alcohol is a huge catalyst to a lot of different types of crime, and specifically violent and sexual crime. Now I'm going to discuss some of the different theories on alcohol and violence and aggression. So the first one is disinhibition theory, which just discusses how alcohol impairs brain function that's responsible for promoting violent behavior. So basically, when you drink alcohol, you don't have that normal alert in your mind that tells you that you shouldn't partake in this behavior. And the next one is cognitive expectation theory. And this one suggests that it's more about the person's beliefs about alcohol that causes the aggressive behavior rather than the actual drug itself. So this one's kind of more like a placebo effect. And then the last one is alcohol myopia theory. And this one talks about how alcohol impairs brain function so that people can only focus on the most prominent signals from their environment. So basically, they just can't focus on a lot of details at once, so they focus on their more primal urges. So now we're going to segue into some of the treatment options for alcoholism. And first, we're going to talk about prevention and specifically deterrence. So, as everybody knows, there are current laws in place which limit the legal BAC to 0.08%, with a zero tolerance policy for individuals under the age of 21. So basically, the point is that we already have laws in place that are meant to deter people from partaking in this behavior because they know that they'll get penalized if they do it. And another one is that we have driver's license suspension laws, which basically means that if you get convicted of a DUI, that your driver's license will get suspended for at least a year, I think it is in most states. So this is also something that is put into place in order to deter people from doing this. And then we also have sobriety checkpoints, which allow law enforcement to stop drivers at specific locations to check for their sobriety. Usually these happen on big holidays like New Year's Eve. Another preventative measure that we have in place is K through 12 education. And this type of education proves to be successful in raising awareness on the effects of drunk driving. And I know at my high school, once a year, right before prom season, we would have this big display of a crashed car and right in the middle of our quad. And it was really effective in showing people that, like, look, this can happen to you if you decide to drive when you're drunk. So another one is Mothers Against Drunk Driving, also referred to as MADD, and this organization is really good at educating people on the effects of drunk driving. In addition, Potter explains how the anti-drunk driving movement demonstrates how concerted action by legislators, public health officials, and activists can redefine a crime as a behavior previously excused as a mere unfortunate outcome of a character weakness. So this is basically just saying that, like, as a whole, society has the power to define what is a crime and what is just like an unfortunate situation. This is an example of a visual aid that is state specific, and it just educates on the different punishments for different crimes. So it goes through and it discusses in Arizona specifically, for just a regular DUI, the minimum punishment is 1 day in jail. And then for an extreme DUI, the minimum is 30 days in jail and 120 days if it is your second offense. And the third is the super extreme DUI, which is punishable by 45 days in jail and 180 days for your second offense. And I just thought this was an interesting resource because this is specific to the state of Arizona. So now we're going to segue into the different types of treatments for alcoholism. So this is an interesting statistic that is pretty unfortunate. Only 8.9% of people aged 12 or older who needed treatment for alcohol use actually received the treatment that they needed. So this is really important because it just shows that the majority of people who do have alcohol issues are not getting the help that they really need. So a few of the different types of treatments that we do have in place currently are cognitive behavioral therapies, motivational enhancement therapies, and 12-step programs. So an example of one of these programs is Alcoholics Anonymous, which most people have heard of. It's also referred to as AA. So Alcoholics Anonymous preaches total abstinence from the drug, and they do group therapy sessions, and they have rigid principles. One of the really popular treatments for DUI offenders are interlock devices, and basically these just require that the driver to breathe into a device to check for their BAC levels before they're able to start the car. So they have to get a 0.00 in order for the engine to start. Also, there's been evidence to suggest the successfulness of programs that utilize intensive supervision and education for DUI offenders. So finally, I've added some resources for people to avoid drunk driving. And the first one, and my personal favorite, is the different kinds of driving services that we have now. And some of these are Uber, Lyft, just using a regular taxi. And in a study, I found that when Uber enters a jurisdiction, that lowers its rate of DUI arrests and traffic fatalities, and in addition, it lowers the arrest rates for assault and disorderly conduct. So this just proves how effective having companies like Uber in a metropolitan area are, because they help give people an alternative to driving drunk when they know that any time of day they can call an Uber and they can have a safe ride home. So another one and more traditional is just having a designated driver that you choose ahead of time before you go out. And then lastly, just making plans ahead of time so you know that if you go out, you're going to spend the night at a friend's house so you know that you won't have to drive home drunk. And here are my references.